Good morning. I want to thank Damien for that beautiful reading and Shirley for your prayer to set our consciousness. Thank you. I got a really sweet text this morning from Dr. Patty Bay. She was missing the talk because she said this is right up her alley. And she wanted to let you know that if she has a free podcast that covers some of this about unhappiness, the call to consciousness. So you can check that out on her podcast. So if you want information on that, I have it here, but I'm going to put it in our weekly update. But there's so many ways that our community reaches out to support each other and some of this spiritual principles that we explore. And as I was preparing for this message, there is an idea, and I absolutely believe with my whole being that happiness is part of our true nature, that in the yogic terms, it is called santosha, deep, abiding contentment. Happiness, not so much that which is joyful, is that silly laughter that we can have, that our muscles hurt from laughing so hard. As I was doing this, I couldn't help but think of Sharon Kennedy, and she's here today, but get her laughing, and then something happens because then you can't stop laughing because sound comes out of her that's pretty unbelievable. And after I remember it so vividly after our panels for ministerial studies, we got the giggles so bad, but then we kind of cleared out the restaurant because she started doing this snort thing, and people were not knowing what was happening. So I won't get her started, but invite her to a party and maybe give her a little bit too much to drink and get her going. How about that? How about that, Sharon? Pretty funny, but that's that over the top, joyful laughter and happiness. And even reflecting on that level of happiness, each one of you have been there at times. You can kind of feel it. It kind of takes over inside your body, and the juices of the brain begin to emit that serotonin level, those levels of happiness that remind you, yes, that is my true nature. I have tapped into that deep knowing, and all is well. There is a more to the story, though, because sometimes we don't feel happy. And everybody around us is happy. And we're longing to try to have that connection, but we feel distant from it. And to me, that's a very sad, lonely place to be. And I find myself diving into those places sometimes, these places of a depression of my spirit. And yet, I know my longing for the divine is much greater than whatever I'm stewing on or suffering with in that moment. So I enjoyed reading all of the things about authentic happiness is one of our books this month, and that is actually a little bit of a dry reading starting off because it's all the research on happiness. So much of our focus in research has to do with suffering, mindfulness and depression, mindfulness and anxiety, mindfulness, go on and on, trying to find where we put our spiritual practices. It doesn't often say mindfulness and happiness. It's not something that people really do a lot of in-depth study on. But Dr. Robert Holden is one that I'm going to read this story because he says, picture the following scene. So this is about him. He's at a friend Jane's house in mid-afternoon, and we're having tea. Jane and I are engaged in a deep and meaningful conversation when her two boys run into the room. They're young, full of energy, lively, and noisy. Tom is 4 years old, Ben is 3. Ben follows Tom everywhere. Jane and I continue to try to talk, but soon we can't hear each other because the boys become into a dispute. What's the problem, Jane says. Tom throws Ben off of him and takes a deep breath. It's my turn to play with my bike, but Ben won't leave me alone, and he's already ridden my bike once today. A few more things are said, but there's no agreement. Go outside and sort this out. Robert and I are trying to talk, says Jane, and the boys are dismissed. A couple minutes go by, the boys run back in with the bike. Before Jane can chastise the boys for bringing a bike into the house, Tom says, "Oh, we worked it all out." "Well, good." And then Tom continues. The little boy says, "Today, the bike belongs to me all day, and tomorrow, the bike will belong to Ben all day." Both boys nod their heads with great enthusiasm. "Oh, and you both agree to that?" says Jane, sounding a little bit surprised. "Yes, we're cool." "Good, now go out and play," she says. The boys turn around to leave, and just before they do, Ben pipes up at the top of his voice, "I know. Let's pretend it's tomorrow." And I just love that. I love the way children reinvent the now. You know, they're both perfectly content with a resolution they came up with together. I think that's a great mom to give them the time to resolve those moments. So this idea of positive being we're focusing on, and what makes you happy. Think about that as we share our time today. Last week, several of us, Marty from the board and Robin and Cherie, Charlie and I, got to enjoy Asilomar. We're anticipating going to Asilomar as an annual conference that we used to experience years ago in this teaching, and they kind of let it go by the wayside over the years and developed other ways to do conferences. But this was back at Asilomar, so we were all eager to be in that atmosphere. However, the drive down there in these last several years is like crazy. It's bumper-to-bumper traffic, and we're driving all day, it seemed, to try to get there. So this dinner starts at 6, and we hadn't eaten because we knew we could eat at 6, but then we're getting a little bit grouchy. And then you try to register, and then you have to register over here. And I kept thinking, great, I'm in a really crummy mood. And we're at Asilomar, and I kept trying to, you know how you don't feel it physically or mentally, but you're trying to pretend. And the person that greeted us is a person named Reverend Sunshine. And I thought, what an annoying name, because I was grouchy. But what an amazing being. What an amazing being. And in fact, she is one of the qualified people that might assume the spiritual leadership of our organization. She was beaming, smiling, gracious, calm, and Charlie, of course, because he's in a good mood, they found his name tag right away. "We can't seem to find yours." And you know, I seem to invite that a lot of times when I'm going to these things. Well, and who are you? And finally, after a couple of dig-throughs of all these name badges, she finds my name, and then she stops. We were walking away, and she said, "Wait a minute, I forgot one thing, my beloveds." And I looked at her, and she gave me the warmest hug. A hug and a smile that was a spiritual hug and a smile. It's almost as if she could reach into me and say, "Now you're here, you have arrived. You'll get your dinner, don't worry about it." You know, so we proceeded. From that moment on, I kept seeing her throughout the weekend, always with this radiant smile, always with this invitation to be here now, to really allow that genuine nature of our deep self to emerge and to be shared with one another. In The Science of Mind, Ernest Holmes reminds us this: the heart is the center of divine love and perfect circulation. Its action is harmonious, vital, adequate, and complete. There is no false action and no wrong action. The pulsation of life are steady, unceasing, and perfect. Let not your heart be troubled. Allow whatever I share today, if it becomes a mantra of truth for you, let your soul absorb that, because the soul is never unhappy. So let not your heart be troubled. Love is the center of our being, and the calm, continuous pulsations of life are governed by this love. It's a prescription of truth. So happiness now is what a book written by Dr. Holden reminds us. In the moment, there is the sacred now. Today, this moment, that's why Eckhart Tolle and all of the current teachers now are saying, pay attention to present moment. Thich Nhat Hanh, present moment. Pay attention to the now. Yesterday is already over, and what happened to you, and you have time to reflect on that, to work on that, to forgive that, to heal that. It is our life's journey. It's our journey of our sense of the ego part of the self. The self that Tara Brach reminded us as we studied her work this summer, the spacesuit that we put on, trying to deal with all of the issues that we came upon. So this sacred now is all wrapped up in your heart, the beating heart of this present moment, more than what has been happening to you or through you or by you or around you. It's your overall response, perception, thoughts, beliefs that we tend to frame what is. But the deep, original self, the divine seed self, is the sacred self, and it is the key to your joy, to your santosha, to the deep abiding contentment. And the invitation that we share week after week, class after class, prayer after prayer, is to remember this true self. It's ever waiting for your realization. Beneath any of your fears, beneath any of the moments that you have doubt or guilt, any of your conditioning, your history, any of your sadness, there is this joy, there is this truth that is ever causing you to smile again. And psychology, interesting enough, used to be the study of the soul. Did you know that? I think it's gotten lost, psychology, because now all it seems to look at is the potential for suffering and weaknesses and pain. And it started to become a focus on all the neuroses that are around and all the mental afflictions. And I knew this as well when I was in nursing school. So think about this, because if I said to you right now, if I really got into the down and dirty and started talking about head lice, it wouldn't take long before some of you were doing this. You know, it's just lice. I remember we had sweetest little lady that had little pink rollers and a little cap on her head, and we all thought, isn't she just so cute, number 301A? And then somebody said, yeah, but we took her rollers out. She's full of lice. Blah! You know, suddenly she's the untouchable. Just like that, where a label, a condition, can change your perception on what was a moment ago a sweet little lady with lice. And treatable. But how many times in nursing school, each week we studied something, one of us had it. Somebody had to go for gallbladder surgery. Somebody had an appendectomy. You know, whatever it was, migraines, all the way to major surgeries. People ended up getting it because we were so invested in learning everything there was about it, we became it. And the same with psychology. Many of the authors that I've read about, they became depressed because that's all they focused on. They started wondering about all the voices that were in their head. They became schizophrenic to a certain degree. They're triggers. They're triggers that cause us to start to experience what we dwell upon. Does that sound familiar? So he shares this in his work. Think about Deb Black and I were talking a little bit about this idea of happiness, and it is the archetype for this, think about it, is Eeyore and Tigger, right? Eeyore, you right away, you know, oh, it's gonna happen to me. They're not gonna find my name tag. I'm too grumpy. And this kind of an Eeyore feeling versus Charlie, the Tigger, we're here, we're here, we're here. Here, they got my name badge, mine's bigger than yours. You know, and it's just like Tigger, 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 bouncing, 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 down to the eating hall. And there's Eeyore, following him along. But I soon caught on to the Tigger consciousness because joy spreads. It's a better way of being. But oftentimes, the Eeyore consciousness, we slip into a state of unworthiness. But Tigger, remember, Tigger is one that always forgets the bad and chooses to always dwell on a greater good. So work in ways on yourself to find a satisfaction with the past and create a better future. Look at the ideas of contentment and serenity and feeling gratitude for what is, for how you're growing, versus an attitude of being revengeful and unforgiving. Because everyone on this planet wants a future of living in faith and trust and living in an optimistic framework of mind. In the present moment, there we are, abiding in the flow, a sense of calm, a sense of zest, a sense of pleasure, and just welcoming this beautiful day with the beautiful mountain range outlining our beautiful town, the rivers flowing, people getting ready to enjoy family time over Labor Day weekend. So gratitude practices, forgiveness practices. What do you need to do to amplify this good and to dive into the true ideas of what you want to believe in and what you know is true? Byron Katie was a gift to everyone in her work. If you haven't studied her, she's a phenomenal teacher because she boils it down to just a very few questions. Whenever you're suffering, is this true? Is it absolutely true? And when you ask, is it absolutely true, you're in the don't know state. You're in a state where everything kind of pauses. I don't know. My favorite part, what would I be without it? What would I be without this, and what do I want to see? Where do I want my consciousness and my heart to dwell? And the shift begins to happen. No longer are you dwelling in the destructive Eeyore consciousness, but you jump into the Tigger and you're willing to change, and you start bouncing around into that good. There's two verses in the Upanishads, or this verse in the Upanishads about two birds. Inseparable companions, perched on the same tree. Two birds perched on the same tree. One eats fruit, the other looks on. The first bird is our individual self, feeding on the pleasures and the pains of the world. The other is the universal self, silently witnessing all. This true happiness dwells within each and every one of us. There is that self that partakes of the pleasures of this world. And when we do, we also begin to partake in the duality of what is. And then what the Tao also points to is the 1,000 joys and the 1,000 sufferings. Always there. But how do we walk through that valley? How do we walk through that and remember our true nature? Because in the center of all of this is that divine seed of love that Ernest Holmes so beautifully spoke of. The state of wholeness, the state of abundance, the state of peace, the state of, yes, the sacred now. The sacred now. There is the conditioned self that we spoke so heavily upon this summer, and then the unconditioned self, this pure seed self. And this is the state of longing of our hearts. This state, think about it, the conditioned self is the learned self. The unconditioned self, original self. False self, real self. Fearful self, loving self. Critical self, creative self. Lower self, higher self. Dissociated self, unified self. Ego, Holy Spirit. Split self, whole self. Body, mind, spirit, soul. Persona, Atman. Flesh, Christos. Nothing, I am. Sin, source. Hell, heaven. Fallen self, divine self. The look upon naming conditioned self, unconditional self, unconditioned self. We fall, we dance between those. When we're in the conditioned self, our heart is broken. When we stay in the seat of the Atman, of the soul seat, of the seat at the very altar of our heart, and allow our eyes to be the bird that witnesses what is, we start to recognize the thousand joys, the thousand joys. It's the state that I believe all of these teachings are ushering us towards, this true self behind the mask, behind the spacesuit, behind your conditioning, behind your personal history, your learned limitations, your defenses, your doubts, your fears. This original, untouched, pure self is whole and perfect, completely safe. This wholeness self is filled with love and joy. Every tradition, every spiritual tradition speaks of this. The Oriental traditions speak of it as the uncarved block. The Zen, they talk about it as your original face. The Buddhists, the sacred happiness. In North America, you often hear it as free spirit. The Taoists call it your inner smile. I'm going to be talking about that inner smile at the 10:30 service. The Christian mystic calls it the inner Eden. And I love this idea of what Dr. Holden has said about what ego means to him. He's a psychologist. So he says, ego, the small self, everything good is outside. Ego, E-G-O. Everything good is outside, leaving us always feeling like there's never enough. But the inner self is always the observer, smiling. So think about the spiritual statements. How often have you heard the statements and the empowerment of your affirmations to say, I am, versus, am I? Same words. I am empowered. I am happy. Am I? You can feel the doubt. You can feel the shriveling of the heart space when you turn that into a question versus a declaration. So think about that this week. Is it the small self speaking? Am I? Am I worthy? I am worthy. It flips it so beautifully. And to end this, there was a beautiful prayer from Macarena Whitaker, and she uses this prayer to align herself. God, help me to believe the truth about myself. It's such a simple plea to the deep inner self, to that divine seed within us. It can be a universal prayer. Help me to believe the truth about myself. And then she finishes it with, no matter how beautiful it is. There's the point that opens my heart. Let me see the goodness within, no matter how beautiful it is. Versus that idea of, God, show me what's wrong with me. Now that is often the curse of the prayer of our mind. It will whirl that. What's wrong with me? Why can't I get over this? I know all this. I'm a student of this teaching. What's wrong with me? Show me how beautiful I am. Show me. Show me the gateway to my heart, to remember that though mentally I don't feel happy, that physically I can simply turn into that inner smile and allow my lips to turn upward and my eyes to feel that genuineness of this longing to know God, to know love, to know truth. That's knowing your inner light. That's connecting to the goodness that dwells within each one of us, free of that discontent, of that fog of confusion. So what is your relationship? invite you to explore that this week intimately in your reflections, in your spiritual practices, in your moments of deep quietude. What is your relationship to what's happening? And be responsible to pay attention to the moment when you find resolution, joy bubbles up to the surface, happiness bubbles up into ourselves. So let's allow ourselves a sense of freeing from the idea of suffering and allowing ourselves to dwell in that place of deep contentment. Join with me in a prayer that supports this truth. Damien read our quote this morning by Mark Nepo. Remember this, because Mark Nepo is such a brilliant poet, so tapped in. Each person is born with an unencumbered spot, free of expectation and regret, free of ambition and embarrassment, free of fear and worrying. That almost takes me to my knees. This umbilical spot of grace, where we were each first touched by God. We were each touched by the divine. In that holy place, let us be a community. Let us be people in love from that place outward. And remember who we are as we go through this week. Because as Ernest Holmes reminds us, happiness is ours. So we move into prayer. We move into prayer. Feel it. As you relax your shoulders, as you prepare the body physically, as you look at where in myself am I feeling the least contracted, closed down, I open to the divine spirit right here, right now. And I allow my facial muscles to remember the inner smile, the smile of pure, sweet contentment, of santosha, of that joy, of the laughter and the innocence of a baby when they learn their laugh. That innocence, that's me in that smile. It just bubbles forth. It is not taught to us. That divine spark, that holy space of truth, of happiness is mine. It's always dwelled there. It always is. It is my touchstone to all the other joys that I witness, all pale in comparison to this true deep joy that I remember as pure, deep, abiding contentment. And that sense of leading our way into that undefined, unrestricted place. We open to joy. We open to divine truth. We open to celebrate the beauty that is all around us. We turn away from the conditions and the effects that cause us to shrink and to close down, and remember who we are. I am that happiness. I am that joy. I am here to spread this to all my family, to all my friends, to all the community, to all the world. I am that I am. I am that joy I am. I am that happiness. It dwells within me as me. I water the seeds. I remember the smile allows the light to shine through, and it grows deeper and more pure in my being. I speak this word for myself and everyone here. We deserve to be happy and whole. We deserve that. We are ambassadors of that truth. I release this prayer knowing how beautiful we are, and I celebrate the gratitude of that knowing. We walk out of here with lots of books, with lots of CDs. We're so happy. Thank you, God, and so it is.